I've hiked a lot of different trails all over the US, but some of my favorite backpacking trips have been while hiking sections of the Appalachian Trail, mostly in and around the Blue Ridge Mountains. I have lots of other friends that enjoy backpacking in the same area, and we often swap stories of our adventures. Usually, they involve wildlife encounters, getting turned around and temporarily lost, getting soaked due to a freak rainstorm and forgetting another pair of dry socks, stuff like that. I've also heard some stories from fellow hikers and encountered a few things myself that unsettled me and stuck with me long afterwards. These stories have a way of creeping into my thoughts and haunting me on the rare times I hike alone. I spoke with a good friend recently who told me about a backpacking experience she had a couple of years ago. She's an experienced hiker and would sometimes go out on weekend trips, hiking various sections of trail through the Blue Ridge Mountains. This particular time, she described the weather as being clear and cool with not a cloud in the sky. She had been hiking toward a favorite camping spot of hers that she'd been to several times before. She'd gotten a later start than she meant to that day, and the sun was starting to set by the time she got within about a mile of the spot. She said suddenly, this heavy fog rolled in out of nowhere. She remembered it being odd because the weather had been so clear a few minutes before that. Her visibility was limited to about 25 to 30 yards ahead of her, but she pressed on, knowing that her camping spot was only about a mile further down the trail. The whole time she felt this sense of dread creeping up on her. Maybe a couple of minutes after this fog rolled in, she noticed what looked like the vague outline of an elk standing in the middle of the trail. Elk aren't uncommon in the Blue Ridge Mountains, but they can be a lot more dangerous than most people realize. Inexperienced hikers, ignorant of the danger elk can pose, have been known to approach them thinking that they're just gentle giants and have frequently gotten seriously injured or even killed by them as a result. They're no joke. Knowing this, she stopped when she saw it so as to keep her distance and then started backing away slowly. As she did so, to her dismay, it started slowly approaching her. The outline of the beast was still vague, but she could tell that it was bigger than any other elk she'd ever seen. As the shape started to materialize out of the fog, she also realized, to her horror, that this thing wasn't an elk. She could make out the shape of the elk-like antlers and the vague shape of the muzzle and part of the body. But the thing that truly startled her was that the beast was slowly loping towards her on two legs. As soon as she saw this, she turned and ran. Visibility was still very limited, and she had to dodge overhanging branches, tree roots, and large rocks as she ran in a blind panic. After about 10 minutes, she told me that the fog started to clear up and the feeling of dread also faded a little bit along with it. She knew that there was no way she could make it back to her car before dark, so she got off the trail and made her way into the woods until she came to a spot which wasn't visible from the trail and where she felt safe setting up her tent. She described being hunkered down in her tent all night with her knife at the ready and hearing what sounded like an elk bellowing in the woods. If you've ever heard this, you know they can sound pretty unsettling. But she described this bellowing as being deeper and more guttural than a normal elk. At times, it even sounded like the thing was forming what sounded like they could have been words. Sometimes it was closer to her, sometimes further away, and at one point, she thought she heard a second one. The bellowing faded off into the distance as it started getting light outside. She waited until it was bright enough outside to pack up and then booked it out there. She didn't go backpacking in the mountains for a year after that experience and now only goes with friends. As I mentioned, I've heard some strange stories, but that still ranks among the oddest I've heard, and it still bothers me to this day. There's one that bothers me more, though, because it happened to me. My son is in Boy Scouts, and I'm fairly involved as a leader in his troop, so most of the time when his troop goes backpacking, I go too. On one of these trips, we'd just reached our camping spot after a long day's hike. There were still a few hours of daylight left, so after everyone had gotten their tents and gear set up, most of the boys took to exploring the area around the campsite. Another hour or so went by, and this thick, heavy fog rolled in. Everything went dead quiet. The birds were no longer chirping, the leaves stopped rustling in the wind. total silence. Even the words we spoke seemed muffled by the fog. Along with that silence, I began to feel weighed down by this really oppressive sense of what I can only describe as offness. It felt completely unnatural. The other leaders and I were concerned some of the boys could get lost or hurt in this fog, so we called them back to the campsite and counted them off to make sure everyone was present and accounted for. The boys are taught to always have at least one buddy with them at all times, so we counted each scout and confirmed their buddy was with them. The last boy we got to was in a sort of panic. He told us his buddy, he was a younger scout named Adrian, who had wandered off and, after the fog rolled in, was nowhere to be seen. Everything kicked into high gear after that. We told the boys to stay at the camp, and 2 of the adult leaders stayed with them there, while the rest of us went out looking for the missing boy. We had radios with us, so we could communicate if we lost sight of each other. I decided to backtrack down the trail we initially came in on, and eventually came to a spot where I could make out his outline in the fog. As I approached him, I noticed his back was to me, and he was standing stock still facing the woods. I spoke his name softly, and he seemed startled, like he had been in some kind of trance. I asked him what he was looking at and why he'd come back down this part of the trail. He looked up at me with an expression that was a mixture of bewilderment and worry, and told me that, when we'd first passed this spot while we were hiking in, he'd heard what sounded like soft laughter and voices deep in the woods. He came back to investigate, thinking it must have been coming from another campsite. It made sense, but it didn't explain why he'd just been standing there staring. As I pressed him for more answers, he hesitantly told me that shortly after he'd started down this trail, the fog had rolled in. He wasn't aware that his buddy wasn't with him. He was more interested in finding out who was in the woods. When he'd arrive at the spot, he stopped to listen. As he had been standing there trying to see through the fog, he noticed a very tall, he heavily emphasized the word very, pale man peering out from behind a tree at him while also being partially obscured by the fog. As he stood staring, Adrian said he noticed more people scattered around the nearby trees also peering at him. Not saying anything, just peering at him with blank expressions. He said that 1 or 2 of them had made slow hand gestures like they wanted him to come over to them, and he had suddenly felt very tired. That was when I'd found him and startled him, bringing him out of that trance-like state. I looked around and didn't see or hear anything. No birds, no insects, and definitely no people. There was just us and that heavy, oppressive fog. As I started to glance back down at him, I caught a tiny movement out of the corner of my eye. I looked up and for one brief moment caught a glimpse of one of the people he described. He was staring at us with a blank and hollow expression as he backed further into the fog and melted away. If you've ever been to an open casket funeral, you know how the person you're looking at in that wooden box looks so much different than they did in life. They look more like a wax figure straight out of the uncanny valley. That's what the face of that man reminded me of as he was engulfed by the mist. I stood in stunned silence for a moment. As soon as I snapped out of it, we hightailed it back to camp, and I radioed the other leaders to let them know I'd found the missing boy. Eventually, the fog lifted, but the disquieting feeling I felt earlier remained. I still feel that same sense of disquiet whenever I think about that freakishly tall man and his blank, uncanny stare. It's stories and encounters like that haunt me when I'm backpacking through the mountains, and just like the friend I mentioned earlier, I never go alone anymore. I mentioned in one of my previous posts that I love backpacking in the Appalachians, but I never go alone anymore. There are a couple of reasons for this. From a practical standpoint, it's always best to have a buddy with you in case you get hurt, turned around, or encounter less than friendly wildlife. I've also heard of and seen things that I can't explain and that really make me wary of venturing out into nature alone like I used to. There's one path I made an exception for. It was an easy, shorter day hike, and the trail it split off from was well marked and got a decent amount of foot traffic. Plus, it only took about an hour to get to from the parking lot, so it was within fairly easy distance of help if I needed it. but one had to wander off the main trail to get to it. I will never do it again. There was a small series of events that led to this decision, which started with a hiker that went missing a few years ago. The main reason I enjoyed this path so much was that, while the main trail it split off from was frequented by a fair number of visitors, this smaller path was pretty well hidden, easy to miss, and therefore quieter and more peaceful. The opening was blocked off by a fallen tree and some rather dense shrubs. I'd stumbled upon it randomly one day when I stepped off the trail to relieve myself and decided to follow it to see where it led. The path snaked its way through a dense pine grove before it opened up, after about a half-mile, to a small glade with a tiny, peaceful pond near the middle. Entering that glade and being surrounded on all sides by tall pines, I was immediately struck by a sense of awe. It's difficult to describe, but the way the trees pressed in and encircled the glade made it feel as though they crowded around in order to form a protective barrier between itself and its tiny pond and the rest of the world. A few of the pines were hollowed out near the bases of their trunks by age, which gave them the appearance of older, wizened guardians. I was immediately struck by this feeling that I wasn't supposed to know about this place. At the same time, I felt privileged to be there and wanted to stay and enjoy this little world I'd discovered. For several years after that, it became my own personal retreat. I'd pack a lunch on the weekends, spend hours just enjoying the peace and solitude, and then head back out before the sun started to set. Sadly, as time went on, I began to notice the path was starting to get more foot traffic. It seemed I wasn't the only one who had discovered this hidden gem. I started to notice other hikers taking a detour off the main trail every so often towards my spot. In reality, I know I didn't own that glade, and maybe I was being selfish about it. It was still bittersweet. Around that time, life got busier, and I started going there less and less until I eventually stopped going altogether for a long time. That, however, wasn't the last time I'd find myself hiking that path. You see, every so often I see alerts for missing hikers. They're usually found by the park rangers safe and sound in short order, but every so often they have to bring out search and rescue teams and even, occasionally, ask for volunteers to help with the search. I'm friendly with a couple of the park rangers, so I've even been asked if I'd be willing to volunteer once or twice. This particular time, the alert caught my attention enough that I actually reached out to the park ranger department in order to volunteer. A young man had taken a day hike, and, when he didn't return that evening, his family got worried and contacted the authorities. The part that really caught my attention was that he was last reported as seen by an older couple on the main trail I mentioned earlier. Since I know it well and it's a short trail which should have made it an easy one to canvass, I offered to help search. It was not easy. We searched high and low for the missing young man, and eventually, with the family's help, we were able to track his cell phone to the general area he went missing. Surprisingly, that led us to my old path to the glade. It was around 2 p.m. when we arrived at the spot, but we couldn't find a trace of the guy or his phone. We were still able to ping it and knew he had to be in that general area. Aside from finding a small day pack belonging to him, we were completely baffled that there was no other trace of him. The small pond I mentioned was so small that it took no time at all to search. It's possible the phone fell in there, but no one was able to find it or anything else. Eventually, the search party moved on and spread out further, while I stayed behind to gather my thoughts and search for clues we might have missed. By that time, it was starting to get dark. I'd never seen that glade after dark and was shocked at the transformation. The long shadows of the trees looked far more menacing in the dying light, and the older, partially hollowed-out portions of some of the trees seemed to gape open at me. I had a funny feeling, like unseen eyes could have been watching me from them. I shook it off and dismissed it as an overactive imagination. As many of the other searchers were starting to call it a night in order to get an early start the next day, I boogied on out of there as well. The search continued for another week, but yielded no further clues as to the whereabouts of the young man. As a result, the search was eventually called off. Years passed without thought or news for the surely dead hiker, and that would have been the end of the story had I not gone out for drinks recently with one of the park rangers I'm friends with. As we were finishing our last drink, our conversation started winding down. Suddenly, she seemed to remember something, leaned over and lowered her voice. She told me that there had been a violent storm system that had passed through the area recently, leaving a lot of downed trees and debris in its wake. Cleanup crews had been steadily trying to clear some of the major trails and had eventually worked their way to my old path. In the process, they had even added a trail marker for it and had widened the path. Apparently, as they were clearing that path, one of the members of the crew ended up making their way to the small glade on his lunch break. He returned to his crew in a panic and was babbling about having found some human remains. To everyone's surprise, it turned out to be the remains of the missing hiker from those years prior. For the age of the body, it was surprisingly well preserved. The truly shocking part was where the body had been found. He had been in the glade all along inside one of the, now fallen, hollowed-out trees. His body looked like it had been stuffed about 5 or 6 feet up from the opening of a hole in the base of the trunk itself. The cleanup crew had cut away a section of the tree and saw, to their horror, that the body had been folded back on itself so that the head and the feet were closer to the base of the trunk. Almost as if something had reached out from the hollowed-out opening, wrapped around his waist and pulled him up into the tree. It made absolutely no sense. And, while they reported the body to authorities and the family was finally able to get some closure, those disturbing details were never released to the general public or to the family. I was saddened and horrified to hear this. But it got even stranger when my friend told me that, over the last few years, they'd regularly stumbled upon other random hidden paths that branched off from other well-known trails, and that led to similar-looking glades. Every so often, they'd come upon a fallen tree in these glades that had the remains of dead animals that looked like they'd just been crumpled up and stuffed up into the trunks. More disturbing still was that about a week ago, a little girl had gone missing. She had been found the next day, safe and sound. Apparently, after she got separated from her family during a day hike, she had stumbled upon one of these glades. She was clearly very shaken, and, when the rescuers finally got her to speak, she timidly stammered that the entire night she was in that glade, the people in the trees were making faces at her. I can't even begin to describe how unnerved I was as I took in all this information. My friend leaned back in her seat and seemed to feel relieved to have been able to share that with an outsider. She finished, saying that now, whenever they discover one of these small paths leading to these glades, they do their best to keep them hidden and post signage warning people to keep to the main trails. I remembered every lunch and lazy afternoon in my glade with a chilled perspective. I know I'll certainly never be venturing off the beaten path anytime soon.